Many know about slavery, but few discuss paper genocide. We did not all come from Africa, and most of us have Aboriginal roots that were stripped away due to reclassification and miseducation. As a Native Black American and a member of the Muscogee Creek Nation, I understand the importance of tracing your lineage. If you want to learn how to trace your genealogy and apply for tribal citizenship, send an email to mike@keymediapro.com to schedule a consultation.
And they said the freedman was slave to the Indian, but slave don't wear no gun.
Exactly. Listen to the elder. They classified them as slaves. They said, oh, these black folks with the Seminoles are just slaves, but they refused to go to Oklahoma Indian Territory unless they had pistols on them. What slaves you know travel with guns on some Django type shit? Get that nigga off that neck. No. Nuh-uh. He stay up on that horse if he a Seminole. Let's talk about it, y'all. Let's talk about it.
But in 1839, when the Florida Seminoles first arrived at Fort Gibson on the Arkansas River, slave catchers were close behind. Many black Seminoles stayed at the fort and built this commissary for the government. The Army protected them from slave catchers, but still called them slaves.
Guys, when I do the paper trail genealogy research with my clients, guess what? We find ancestors of theirs that were listed as freedmen. We find ancestors of theirs that were listed as slaves, but that don't mean that's the lifestyle they was living. Did you know some slaves had pistols? And if a European tried to subjugate them, they killed them and went to war with them for several years? Oh, that's a hell of a lifestyle for a slave, huh? Guys, just because you do your genealogy and your ancestors were freedmen or your ancestors were slaves, that does not mean African. And even a lot of these black Seminoles were Aboriginals that were relabeled as African and with other misnomers and false titles. But a lot of the Africans that did come to North America, when they fled the plantation, they went to the Seminole tribe in Florida because they knew that was a safe haven. So you've got a mix. You got black Indians with no African admixture. You got black Indians with African admixture and everything in between. But guys, put a 1 in the chat. Nah, fuck that. Put some fists and feathers in the chat if you didn't realize that some of our ancestors who were listed as slaves on records were actually living totally free. Freer than you and me. You may live in a state that doesn't have open. Our ancestors was open carrying with it in the 1800s.
The persecution continued. In 1849, blacks among the Seminoles were legally declared slaves. In defiance, Seminole war hero John Horse and his partner Wildcat rebelled. They led 300 followers out of Indian Territory into Mexico.
They chose Mexico, I imagine, because it was supposed to be free over there. They could do what you wanted. If they had stayed over here, they'd be back in slavery again.
The Seminoles lived near the Rio Grande for 20 years, where they served as border patrol for the Mexican government. The Seminoles' expertise as horsemen and sharpshooters made an impression, even on the American side of the river, where they were still considered slaves. Soon after the Civil War abolished slavery in the United States, the U.S. Army recruited the Seminoles as border scouts. They were stationed here at Fort Clark, Texas. The Army promised wages and land.
Come on, y'all. Come on, y'all. Come on, y'all. Wait a minute. Foul on the play. Foul on the play. Foul on the play. This is a tale as old as time. The U.S. government wants to persecute us and then later on ask us to win battles for them. They did that in the Revolutionary War, in the Seminole War, and now we're learning how they did that in the Indian Wars. We already heard how they persecuted the Seminoles, tried to make them slaves. They had to battle them for 7 years. Then they tried to force them west of the Mississippi to Oklahoma Indian Territory. They said, we're not going unless our black Seminoles go with us. All that shit for the U.S. government to come around and be like, hey, so we need your help fighting these other Indian tribes. So can you come be scouts for us in our army? And we promise we'll treat you better than before.
In 1970 to form the scouts, to scout for the government. That's why they came back. And they promised them land. and that they would take care of them. And each man that came over and they used him as a scout would get the same pay as a private. And then they would let the rest of the family stay on the land. But the guys that were scouts would take care of the rest of the people, you know, as the families. And that's the way they did. They stayed together. And if I had, you had.
The Seminole Scouts served the U.S. government for 34 years. They earned 3 Congressional Medals of Honor. Descendants of the Seminole Scouts had to obtain permission to visit this land at Fort Clark, where their parents and grandparents once had homes.
And the road to the cemetery is right up
That's
above
right.
there.
That's back down over in that. Now it's changed so much I hardly.
Yeah,
Isn't it
it's,
pathetic?
Fine.
The army kept them there until they thought it was peaceful enough. Then after because they didn't need them any longer, well, they just put them off, told them they had to leave. And I learned that, of course, there would be some dissensions about it because they had never thought of it, had never thought they would ever have to leave. They had established their homes and was getting along comfortably.
Fort Clark is no longer a military base, but a private residential club.
When they first opened up, you paid to go in the gates to get down on the reservation and all. And that was one of the reasons why I joined, because I felt that I was born down there. That's our land. And they shouldn't have taken it. And there is a bit of bitterness.
Seminole Scout families lost their Fort Clark homes, while Seminole freedmen in Oklahoma were being swindled out of land allotted to them from the original Seminole reservation.
Guys, do you understand how badly they fucked over our ancestors? They flee the plantation, get adopted in by the Seminole tribes. The government's like, hey, no, Seminoles, give those black folks up. They're slaves. They're slaves. They say, no, we're going to fight you for several years. While they're fighting them actively, they're slave catchers stealing the black Seminoles and sending them to plantations. They rebel. They win wars. Some of them end up succeeding, going to Oklahoma, Indian Territory, west of the Mississippi. Some people like John Horse fought to the end. They went to Mexico. They were allotted land in Mexico and became border patrol for the Mexican government. But those that relocated to Oklahoma, that was supposed to be Indian Territory with no white folks, you know, later the white folks come and through land lotteries and illegal schemes, some legal schemes as well, they steal the Indian Territory from the Indians. You push the Indians to the middle of nowhere, to the desert to die, basically. And then later on, you still come and take your land. What? And then they co-opt and convince some of the black Seminoles to work for the government that previously oppressed them to help them win the Indian Wars and to be scout leaders. And then those families of the scout leaders get their land taken.
They don't want you to remember this. You not no slave, you indigenous. Fuck how they painted them Indians. You went to war with the French and the British men. Quite frankly, you was kings, Merovingians. They took the women and men, made them prisoners, raised up the children to worship their images, set up a lab to the genes and they mixed them. And this shit get way deeper than your pigment.